Everything just changed for the Indiana Fever, and the timing couldn't be more intense. A roster move drops out of nowhere. Shatori Walker-Kimbrough is suddenly gone, waived from the team, and just like that, a spot opens up on a roster already under pressure, already under scrutiny, and already being watched more closely than almost any team in the league. But that's not even the biggest shock. Because right as questions start piling up about why now, another update hits the timeline that completely flips the energy again. Caitlin Clark? Now listed as probable. From uncertainty to availability, in the span of what feels like a single breath. And suddenly, everything surrounding the Indiana Fever feels like it's moving at full speed with no pause button. A roster spot opens. A superstar potentially returns. And the clock starts ticking immediately, because the Fever don't just have time to think, they have hours to act. Who gets signed? What direction does the front office even go in? And is this a simple basketball adjustment, or a sign that something deeper is shifting inside the organization right as the season pressure reaches its peak? Because when roster decisions, injury updates, and coaching strategy all collide at the exact same moment, it never feels random to fans watching closely. It feels like a turning point. And right now, Indiana isn't just making a move, they're reacting under pressure, with every decision being dissected in real time by fans, analysts, and the entire league. And what happens next could quietly reshape not just the rotation, but the entire direction of their season. Because this isn't just about who got waived, or who might play next game. It's about what the Fever choose to do in the next few hours that could define everything that comes after it. To really understand why this moment feels so loaded, you have to look at how tightly packed everything has become around the Indiana Fever right now. Nothing is happening in isolation anymore. Every roster decision, every injury update, every coaching adjustment is landing in an environment where expectations are already sky high and patience is extremely thin. And that's the key backdrop to this entire situation. The Fever aren't just operating as a normal WNBA team this season. They are operating under a spotlight that follows every move they make, because of the attention surrounding Caitlin Clark and the way her presence has reshaped how this franchise is viewed, discussed, and analyzed. That kind of spotlight changes the weight of even the smallest transaction. A routine roster move elsewhere in the league might go unnoticed. Here, it becomes a storyline. So when Shatori Walker-Kimbrough is waived, it's not just a standard roster adjustment in the middle of a long season. It immediately becomes part of a larger conversation about depth, strategy, rotation trust, and urgency. And urgency is the word that keeps coming back into focus. Because the Fever's roster situation isn't just about talent, it's about timing. The WNBA season moves fast, rotations tighten quickly, and opportunities to adjust personnel without consequences shrink as chemistry becomes more locked in. When a team makes a move like this midstream, it's never just about one player leaving. It's about what that move enables, or what pressure it relieves, or what problem it might be trying to fix. At the same time, another major storyline is sitting right next to it: Caitlin Clark's availability. Even the wording matters here: not ruled out, not fully cleared, but listed as probable. In sports, that designation is often the middle ground between uncertainty and confirmation. It signals that something has changed, that the situation has stabilized enough for participation to be on the table. And that alone shifts the entire emotional temperature around the team. Because when your primary star might be returning, everything else becomes secondary for a moment. Rotations, bench depth, lineup experimentation, all of it suddenly gets recalculated around one central question. How do you support her return without disrupting what has been holding the team together? That's where roster decisions like waiving a player become more than just paperwork. They become strategic signals. And this is where fans start reading between every line. Some see it as simple roster management, a team adjusting personnel to match availability, performance needs, and matchup planning. Others see it as a sign of instability, a front office constantly tweaking the edges while still searching for the perfect balance. And in the middle of that debate sits the coaching staff, trying to maintain competitive focus while also managing expectations that extend far beyond the court. Because every decision now carries dual meaning. A substitution isn't just tactical, it's symbolic. A waiver isn't just procedural, it becomes interpreted as direction. And an injury update isn't just medical, it becomes narrative fuel. That's the environment this roster move lands in. And now the pressure intensifies for one simple reason: time. There is a limited window to fill the newly opened roster spot, And whatever decision is made next will be immediately analyzed through the lens of both short-term performance and long-term planning. Do they prioritize size? Do they prioritize shooting? Do they prioritize familiarity with the system? Or do they look for a role player who can stabilize minutes while key players manage workload fluctuations? Each option comes with trade-offs, and each one will be judged instantly by a fan base that is now fully locked into every detail. Because the moment Caitlin Clark is even listed as probable, the entire roster conversation shifts again. Now the question becomes not just who fills the spot, but how that player fits around a potentially returning centerpiece. And that's where things get even more interesting. Because roster construction in basketball is rarely just about talent. It's about fit, timing, and chemistry. One addition can completely change spacing, ball movement, defensive assignments, and late-game rotations. So what looks like a simple waiver transaction on the surface is actually part of a much larger puzzle that is still actively being solved in real time. And fans can feel that uncertainty. That's why every update feels amplified. Every change feels like it's connected to something bigger. Every announcement feels like it's part of a sequence rather than a standalone decision. Because right now, the Fever are not just managing a roster. They are managing momentum, expectations, and perception, all at the same time. And that combination is what makes this moment feel like a turning point rather than just another transaction in a long season. Which brings everything to the edge of the real question everyone is now asking. What exactly are they building toward with this move? And how quickly do they need to get it right? The moment the roster move went public, everything around the Indiana Fever started moving faster. Not just inside the organization, but across the entire fan ecosystem that now reacts to every update in real time. Because waiving a player is never just an isolated transaction in a season like this. It instantly triggers 3 separate conversations at once. What does this mean for the rotation? What does this say about the coaching staff's confidence in the bench? And what does it signal about what's coming next? And this time, all 3 questions collided almost immediately. Shatori Walker-Kimbrough's exit didn't arrive with warning signs for most fans. One day she's part of the roster picture, competing for minutes in a crowded guard rotation, and the next, she's gone. On paper, roster churn in professional basketball isn't unusual. Teams adjust constantly. They evaluate fit. They respond to injuries. They balance contracts, performance, and tactical needs. But in this specific moment, nothing feels routine anymore. Because the Fever aren't operating in a normal emotional environment. They're operating in a pressure chamber. Every decision is being interpreted through urgency. Every move is being compared against expectation. Every adjustment is being pulled into a larger narrative about stability, direction, and control. And that's where things start to split into 2 interpretations. On one side, there's a straightforward basketball explanation. Maybe the coaching staff saw a need for a different skill set. Maybe they wanted to open up flexibility in the backcourt. Maybe they're preparing for matchups where size, defense, or shooting spacing matters more than depth in a specific role. In that reading, this is just roster optimization, a standard midseason adjustment that happens in every league. Nothing more. But on the other side, the interpretation is much more emotionally charged. Because fans have started to view every move as part of a pattern shaped by inconsistency, shifting rotations, and the constant pressure of trying to stabilize a team that has been under a microscope since day one. So when a veteran guard is waived, it doesn't just look like roster management. It looks like reaction. And reaction, in sports narratives, always implies pressure. Then the second piece of news lands almost simultaneously. Caitlin Clark is now listed as probable. And suddenly, the tone around the entire situation shifts again. Because probable changes everything. It doesn't guarantee anything, but it signals something important has changed behind the scenes. It suggests progress, stabilization, or at the very least, a shift away from uncertainty. And for fans, that creates a new layer of speculation. Was the roster move made with this return in mind? Was space being cleared strategically? Is the rotation being reshaped around her availability? Or is this all just coincidence stacking on top of coincidence? And this is where the conflict really begins. Because now 2 timelines are running in parallel. Timeline A routine roster adjustment followed by a standard injury status update. Timeline B, a coordinated sequence of roster and availability changes that hint at deeper planning. And the problem is, Both timelines can be argued from the outside using the same set of visible facts. That's what makes this situation so volatile. Inside fan discussions, the reaction splits instantly. One group focuses on basketball logic, minutes distribution, defensive needs, spacing, matchups. They argue that waiving a bench player is not a dramatic event, and that probable is still far from certainty. Another group focuses on emotional context, the timing, the pressure, and the recent volatility in lineup decisions. They see the moves as part of a broader attempt to stabilize a situation that has felt inconsistent. And once those two interpretations take hold, every new detail gets filtered differently. Then comes the moment that pushes everything from discussion into conflict. Because analysts start asking a simple but uncomfortable question. Why now? Why make a roster move at the exact same time a major availability shift is happening? Why compress two major updates into the same window instead of spacing them out? And while there are perfectly normal explanations for that, administrative timing, internal deadlines, roster mechanics, the perception doesn't separate cleanly from a sequence. It just sees proximity. And proximity becomes narrative fuel. Meanwhile, inside the organization, the actual basketball reality is likely much less dramatic than the outside conversation suggests. Coaching staffs constantly evaluate combinations. Medical teams constantly update player readiness. Front offices constantly adjust roster flexibility based on upcoming matchups. But none of that internal complexity is visible to the public in real time. So what fans see instead is a simplified version. A player leaves. A star becomes probable. A roster spot opens. And the clock starts ticking. That clock becomes the center of everything. Because now the Fever don't just have a roster decision to make, they have a perception problem to manage. Every potential signing will be evaluated not just for skill, but for meaning. Every move will be interpreted as either stability or desperation. And every delay will be seen as uncertainty. And that's where the tension reaches its first peak. Because the next decision isn't just about filling a roster spot. It's about controlling the narrative that's forming around every move they make. And whether intentional or not, the sequence of events has already created one unavoidable reality. The next signing, whoever it is, will be seen as a signal. Not just a transaction. A signal of direction. A signal of confidence. Or a signal of pressure. And as the hours begin to tick down, one question becomes unavoidable. What kind of move do you make when every option is already being interpreted as something bigger than basketball? As the clock kept ticking toward roster deadline pressure, the situation around the Indiana Fever stopped feeling like a simple lineup adjustment and started feeling like a live decision under a microscope. Because now every update wasn't just news, it was being interpreted like a clue. And that's where the entire conversation took another sharp turn. The roster spot created by the waiver didn't stay neutral for long in the public narrative. The moment it opened, speculation filled it instantly. Fans started mapping out possibilities. A defensive wing, a shooting specialist, a front court size addition, or a developmental player elevation from within. Every angle got discussed within minutes, because once urgency enters the picture, analysis becomes instant. But what changed the tone even further was what came next. Caitlin Clark being listed as probable didn't just soften concern, it intensified interpretation. Because probable doesn't just mean availability. It signals decision-making happening close to game time. And in a system where timing matters, that word alone triggered a new wave of questions. Was the roster move made with her return in mind? Was the team preparing for a specific lineup configuration? Or was this just natural overlap between unrelated decisions? And this is where the narrative splits again, but more sharply this time. Interpretation 1. Everything is standard. A roster adjustment. A recovering player. A normal WNBA decision cycle compressed by scheduling. Interpretation 2. Everything is connected. A reshaping of the roster happening at the exact moment a franchise-altering player becomes available again. And once those two interpretations exist at the same time, neither one disappears. They compete. Social media reactions escalated immediately. Clips of analysts discussing roster flexibility started circulating with added commentary overlays. Threads broke down what this means for rotation structure. Fans debated whether the team would prioritize spacing, defense, or ball handling depth in the next signing. But the most intense part wasn't the speculation itself. It was the speed. because decisions that normally take days to analyze were now being dissected in minutes. Then came the second layer of escalation, because attention shifted from who left to what the move represents. A waived player is always a tactical decision in professional basketball. It can be performance-based, matchup-based, salary-based, or simply roster balancing. But in high-pressure environments, interpretation often replaces explanation. And here, interpretation took over completely. Some analysts framed it as a clean basketball reset, a bench adjustment, a shift in rotation priorities, a move to create flexibility for upcoming games where matchup-specific depth might matter more than current redundancy. Others, however, saw something different. A team constantly adjusting under pressure, reacting to lineup instability, and trying to find equilibrium while key availability remains uncertain. And that divergence matters, because it shapes how every future move is read. Then the conversation took another turn when focus shifted to timing patterns. Not official deadlines. Not confirmed internal reasoning. But sequence. Because in modern sports narratives, sequence becomes a language of its own. Roster move first. Availability update next. Immediate speculation after. And that order, whether intentional or coincidental, became the foundation of debate. Because if the roster move and the probable designation are unrelated, then this is just normal overlap. But if they are connected in any way, structurally or strategically, then it becomes a coordinated response to shifting conditions. And that distinction is exactly what fans started arguing about. Meanwhile, inside the actual team environment, the reality is almost certainly more procedural than dramatic. Coaching staff evaluates rotations continuously. Medical staff updates player readiness constantly. Front offices respond to roster limitations and matchup demands routinely. But none of that internal process is visible to the public. So what fans see instead is a compressed version of reality, stripped of nuance, but heavy on timing. And timing, in sports media, is everything. Then another subtle but important detail entered the conversation. The urgency of the roster window itself. Because once a player is waived, the roster doesn't just remain static. It creates immediate compliance pressure. A replacement must be considered, evaluated, and signed within a narrow operational window. That transforms what looks like a simple decision into a time-sensitive chain reaction. And that urgency feeds speculation even further. Now every potential signing is being viewed through two lenses at once: basketball fit and narrative impact. Because in today's environment, those two things are no longer separate. A signing isn't just about performance, it's about what it signals. And that's where the most explosive layer of discussion emerges. Because fans start asking not just who should they sign, but what are they trying to prove? Are they stabilizing depth? Are they reshaping rotation identity? Are they preparing for a return that changes everything? Or are they simply reacting in real time to pressure building around every decision? And none of those questions have clear answers yet. Which is exactly why the story keeps accelerating instead of slowing down. Because now the situation has evolved beyond roster mechanics. It's about interpretation. And once interpretation becomes the driving force of a narrative, facts alone are no longer enough to settle it. And just as the discussion seems to settle into competing theories, a new development begins circulating, one that reframes the entire roster decision window yet again, and pushes the conversation toward an even more decisive turning point. By this point, the conversation around the Indiana Fever had fully escaped the boundaries of normal roster discussion. It wasn't just fans reacting anymore. It was a layered, fast-moving debate involving analysts, casual viewers, media voices, and basketball-focused communities all trying to interpret the same set of updates in real time. And what made it even more intense was that nothing about the situation had a single, clean explanation everyone agreed on. Instead, everything existed in interpretation. On one side of the debate, there was a calm basketball-centered perspective. This group looked at the roster move and saw standard professional basketball logic. A player gets waived. A roster spot opens. The team evaluates needs. A star is listed as probable. A rotation adjustment becomes likely. From this viewpoint, nothing unusual was happening at all, just the natural rhythm of a professional season where decisions are constantly adjusted based on performance, health, and matchup demands. To them, the situation was being overread because of timing, not substance. But on the other side, the interpretation was much more emotionally charged. This group didn't just see transactions, they saw patterns. They pointed to the proximity of events, the waiver, the injury update, the urgency around roster compliance. They questioned whether these were independent actions or part of a broader response to internal pressure. And once that interpretation took hold, every detail became meaningful. Even neutral updates started feeling loaded. Sports analysts entered the conversation next, and the tone became more measured, but still divided. Some emphasized that roster churn is extremely common in professional basketball. Teams constantly test combinations, adjust depth, and respond to shifting availability. They argued that compressing multiple updates into a short window doesn't imply coordination. It often just reflects the reality of how fast decisions must be made during a season. But others acknowledged something more subtle. Even if everything is procedurally normal, the way it appears publicly can still create confusion. And in modern sports, perception spreads faster than explanation. That became the central tension of the entire debate. Not whether the moves were legal, not whether they were standard, but whether they looked connected when placed side by side. And that distinction is what fueled the reaction cycle. On social media, the conversation fragmented into multiple overlapping threads. One group focused on basketball fit, debating who should fill the roster spot, what skill sets were missing, and how rotations might adjust if Caitlin Clark returns fully available. Another group focused on timing, breaking down the sequence of announcements and questioning why updates seemed to cluster together. And another group focused purely on emotion, reacting to uncertainty, interpreting silence, and filling gaps with speculation. All three narratives coexisted at the same time. And that coexistence is what kept the story alive. Because once a situation becomes multi-interpretable, it stops having a single direction. It branches. Meanwhile, analysts began zooming out further. Instead of focusing only on the fever, they started discussing what this situation says about modern professional sports communication overall. How quickly narratives form. How fast speculation spreads. How limited internal context is compared to external interpretation. And how a single roster move can spiral into league-wide discussion when star players are involved. That's when the conversation stopped being just about Indiana and started becoming about structure. Another major theme emerged in commentary: expectation pressure. Because when a team has a high-visibility star, every decision around them becomes amplified. A minor adjustment elsewhere in the league would barely register. But here, everything is magnified, not because the rules are different, but because attention is different. And attention changes interpretation. That's why even routine updates began to feel significant. A roster move wasn't just roster management anymore. It became a signal, real or perceived, about direction, urgency, or internal priorities. But despite all the debate, one thing remained unchanged. No official statement had reframed the situation in a way that fully unified the narrative. And that absence of closure is what kept the conversation active. Because when there's no definitive resolution, every new piece of information gets added to the existing uncertainty instead of replacing it. And so the debate continued to cycle. Was this just standard roster management under normal constraints? Or was it a compressed sequence of decisions happening under pressure that simply looked more dramatic because of timing and visibility? Neither side could fully prove their interpretation from public information alone. And that uncertainty became the engine of engagement. Because in the end, what keeps a story like this alive isn't confirmation. It's ambiguity. And right now, ambiguity is exactly what the fever situation has the most of. And just when it seemed like the discussion might settle into routine analysis, a final development begins circulating, one that shifts attention away from interpretation and back toward what happens next on the roster itself, where the next move could quietly redefine everything again. Just when the conversation started to feel like it might settle into normal roster talk again, something else began to shift in the background. Not an official announcement. Not a press conference. But a pattern people were starting to notice in real time. Because the Fever's roster situation didn't just remain open after the waiver, it stayed open longer than expected. And in a league where timing windows are tight, even a short delay becomes noticeable when everything else is already under a microscope. The roster spot created by the waiver didn't immediately translate into a clear replacement decision. And that pause became its own talking point. Because now the focus wasn't just on who left, or who might return. It was on why the decision hadn't been finalized yet. In normal conditions, Teams often move quickly. Waive a player, evaluate options, sign a replacement, stabilize rotation. But here, every step was being watched, interpreted, and discussed publicly before anything even became official. And that changes how organizations operate. Even small delays start to look intentional, even when they're not. Then the discussion shifted again back to Caitlin Clark's probable status, because that single designation became the anchor for almost every theory surrounding the roster move. If she plays, the roster adjustment looks like support structure building. If she doesn't, it looks like a rotation still searching for stability. And because nothing was confirmed yet, both interpretations stayed alive at the same time. That's what made this moment so unusual. Everything depended on something that hadn't happened yet. Fans began mapping out scenarios again. If she returns, who benefits most from the open roster spot? If she's limited, does the team prioritize depth or spacing? If she's fully cleared, does the rotation tighten immediately? Each question led to another question.
No answers.
Just branching possibilities. Meanwhile, analysts started stepping back from speculation and focusing on structure again. And they pointed out something important. Roster decisions in professional basketball are rarely about single events. They are about alignment between health, schedule, matchups, and long-term planning. Which means what looks like a sudden shift from the outside is often just the visible part of a much longer internal evaluation process. But even that explanation didn't fully calm the conversation, because perception had already been established. And once a narrative forms around timing, it becomes difficult to unsee it. So now the entire situation rests on two simple but unresolved questions. Was this a standard roster adjustment happening in a compressed timeline? Or is this part of a larger sequence of decisions that only make sense when viewed together? And the frustrating part is that both explanations still fit the visible facts, which is why neither side of the debate is fully disappearing. Then came the final layer of tension, the urgency of what happens next. Because roster windows don't stay open forever. At some point, a replacement has to be signed, a rotation has to be finalized, and preparation for the next game has to move forward. And whatever decision is made will immediately be interpreted through everything that has already happened. That's the real turning point. Not the waiver, not the injury update, but the next move. Because now, every possible signing carries meaning beyond basketball. A defensive specialist becomes a statement about stability. A developmental player becomes a signal about internal confidence. A veteran signing becomes a message about urgency. Even silence becomes a message. And that's where the story leaves off. Not with resolution, but with anticipation. Because the roster spot is still open. The star's availability is still uncertain. And the next decision hasn't been made yet. And until it is, everything remains in motion. One move is coming next. And whatever it is, it won't just fill a roster spot. It will define how this entire stretch of the season is remembered. And just like that, everything is still hanging right on the edge. A roster spot sitting open. A team trying to stabilize rotation pressure. A star player listed as probable but still surrounded by uncertainty. And a fan base watching every single update like it's a turning point in real time. Because that's what this has become now. Not just a normal stretch of the season, but a sequence of decisions that feel connected, even when they might not be. And whether you see it as simple roster management, or a sign of something more urgent happening behind the scenes, one thing is undeniable. Nothing about this moment feels ordinary anymore. So now the real question lands with you. Do you think this is just standard WNBA roster movement happening at a faster pace because of scheduling pressure and injuries? Or do you think there's something deeper going on with how this team is trying to stabilize everything around key availability and rotation structure? Because both sides of the argument sound convincing depending on how you piece the timeline together. And that's exactly why this conversation isn't slowing down. Drop your thoughts below, seriously. Because every angle adds something different here. Who would you sign to fill that roster spot right now? Do you think the Fever should prioritize size, shooting, or defensive stability? And most importantly, do you think the timing of everything is just coincidence, or does it actually say something about how the team is operating right now? There's no single correct reaction here, just a lot of interpretations happening at once. And that's why people are so locked in on it. And keep in mind, this situation is still developing. The roster spot hasn't been finalized yet. The next signing hasn't been announced. And Caitlin Clark's final status for the next matchup could still shift how everything is viewed again. So whatever happens next, it's not going to sit quietly. It's going to be analyzed, debated, and broken down the moment it drops. So if you want the next update as soon as it breaks, make sure you stay locked in, because the next roster move could completely reset the conversation again. And trust me, in a situation like this, the next decision might matter more than all the speculation that came before it.